since we have limited time. And the topic today is making dashboards dynamic, basically making dynamic properties in dashboards. Okay, so I do have a dashboard already up somewhere here, so let me find this dashboard. So this is a dashboard that I just whipped up this morning. And there's nothing really extraordinary about it. It's just, to give us something to work with here. So you can see that there's a chart and there's a table, it's a crosstab table. And then I've got some, basically a tabbed interface over here. Selection list 1, selection list 2, selection list 3. These are 3 different selection lists, and if you were present for past trainings, you already know how selection lists work. Basically, they're filters. And then I've got a range slider here, actually a couple of range sliders that are overlapping each other. If I expand this, you can see that there are 2 different range sliders. Okay, now, as it stands, this isn't the greatest looking interface. Usually you would not put selection lists into a tabbed interface like this. But my plan here is to make a variety of things dynamic so that, for example, the user will only see one of these selection lists at any given time, depending on other choices that they make. So, for example, if the user chooses that they want to see the companies displayed on the x-axis of the chart, then I want to show them a company selection list. If their user decides that they want to see the state names on the x-axis, then I want to show them a state selection list. So the reason that I set up things this way is basically so that I can achieve that result. So as things stand now, there's just, it's a table, a chart, there are some labels here, these are just text elements, and then these selection elements that I've put into tabbed interfaces. In case you're wondering how to make a tabbed interface, I'll just very quickly illustrate. It's the same process for any elements, right? So if you have a couple of different elements and you want to put these elements into a tabbed interface, you just drag one element on top of the other element, and that gives you an option to place component into tabbed interface, and if you press OK, that will give you this kind of tabbed interface. So that's how I made these tabbed interfaces. Okay, but that's not the point of this little class, so let's get on with the dynamic properties. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to give the user a choice of the dimension that's displayed on the x-axis over here, and I want them to have 3 different options, either category, state, or company. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an input control. Okay? And this is the typical way that you make properties dynamic. Well, there are other ways. I mean, you can make properties dynamic purely through script, but generally what you're going to do is you're going to use input components. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to find a combo box. A combo box is basically a menu. And I'm going to drag that in over here right under this dimension label. And I can make this a little bit bigger, okay, something like that. And maybe shift it over a little bit. Just nudge it a little bit over there. Okay, so I've got this combo box. Right now there's nothing in it, but that's the next thing I'm going to do. I want this to have 3 different options, and what I can do is I can find the field names that I want the user to select from. I want them to be able to choose either category or state or company. Right? And so what I can do is I can just grab those field names and drop them right into that input component. So there's category, there's company, and then state was the last one. Okay, so this is how you hook up an input component, or rather how you populate an input component. Right, so now this menu has 3 choices, category, company, and state. Now, at the current time, if I make any of these selections, nothing will happen. Right? If I select state, nothing happens in the chart because I did not hook up the input component to the chart. That's going to be something that I'll do in just 20 seconds. But before I do that, whenever you're using input components, you should always give the component a meaningful name. All right, so how do you do that? You right-click on the component. So I'm going to right-click on this input component, select Properties. And every component has a name. This is just an identifier for the component. It's not something that the user will see. It's just to help you, when you're designing the dashboard, distinguish different components. So I'm going to give this a name, let's say dimension. because this is the input control in which the user is going to select a dimension to display on the chart, so I'll give it a meaningful name that will clue me in later on that that's what it does. So that's the only change that I'm going to make here. Press OK. And now I can go ahead and hook up that, that input component to the chart. So to do that part, basically what I'm saying is that I want to change a particular property, and the property that I want to change is the field that's displayed on the x-axis. So where do I find that property ordinarily? Where would I go to set that property? Well, if I wanted to put a different field on the x-axis over here, what I would do is I would open up the chart editor. All right, and this is how you set up a chart. We've done charts before, so hopefully for those of you who were here before or have played with the software, you know how to use this chart editor at some level. And so ordinarily, if we wanted to change the field that's displayed on the x-axis, we would just drop a different field in here, for example, state or company or date or whatever we wanted on the x-axis. But in this case, I want to make this dynamic. I want the input control to determine what field is displayed on the x-axis. And to do that, I'm going to click on the little pop-up button here. It's the little button with the triangle on it. And then select Variable. All right, I'm going to select Variable. All right, and that then allows me to choose any of the input controls that I have in the dashboard. Right now I only have one input control. That's the one that we just added, the combo box. And so that's my only choice here. But you'll see as we go along in this example, I'm going to add more input controls, and then the menus that I see listing the various inputs, the various variables, will grow longer. But for now, my only choice is to select dimension here, meaning that the dimension combo box is going to set that field. And that's basically it. Right? So that's how I make that property, the x-axis property, dynamic. Right? So now I can select different settings here. For example, category. I see category on the x-axis. If I select company, I see company on the x-axis. And if I select state, then I see state on the x-axis. So that's our first illustration of how you can make properties dynamic. And so basically, what you're looking for when you're setting out to make your dashboard dynamic is you're looking for these little pop-up buttons, because this is kind of the key to the whole thing. Rather than setting the pop-up here, rather than setting it to value, which means a fixed value, you can choose either variable, which means that you're going to use an input control, an input component to set that value, or you can set it to expression, which means that you're going to use script to set that value, and we'll do an example of that later on. So really, if there's a core to this lesson, this is it, that in order to make properties dynamic, choose either variable or expression to set the property. Okay, let's do a little bit more. Let's do the same thing for measure. Let's give the user a choice of two different measures. Measure is what's displayed on the y-axis in this case. So right now it's always the total. It's the sum total. Let's give them a choice of either total or quantity purchased. So what I'll do is I'll add another input component, another combo box in this case. And I'll just try to move that over like that. Okay, and I want the user to be able to select from two different measures. And the way that I do that is the same way that I did above. I can just find those measures, in this case quantity purchased and total are going to be the two measures. All right, and I just populate the menu just by dropping those measures in there. Okay, and that's fine. Now, one thing that bothers me a little bit here is that when I select quantity purchased, I can't see the whole label. It's a minor thing. Of course, I could just make the control wider to display it, but I could also change the label. Since I don't want to move these other things out of the way, I'm just going to change the label. So to do that, I go into Properties, right? And in the List Values area, this is where you set the list that populates the component. All right, so we did that the quick and easy way just by dragging the field names in to the component itself, but you can also do that by coming over here to the embedded list, press edit, all right, and there's the fields that we added, and I can just change the label. The label is what is displayed in that list, and those are arbitrary. You can change them to whatever you want. You do have to be careful, as I've mentioned before, when you set the value. These, in this case, these have to match the actual field name, so I don't want to change the values, but the labels are fine to change. Okay, so that makes it a little bit more readable. And then I have to do the same thing that I did for the input control above, which is, first of all, give it a meaningful name. So I'm going to right-click, go back into the properties. I could have done this just a moment ago, but I forgot. And for the name of this, I'll just call it measure, right, because this input control is going to be used to set the measure on the chart. So I'll just call it measure, press OK. Right, and then I have to go ahead and hook it up to the chart. And the procedure, again, is the same as above. To do this, I open up the chart editor because I need to find where that property is. And here it is. Right? The property that I want to modify is the field that goes on the y-axis of the chart. Right now it's set to total, right? And that's just permanent. But if I want to make it variable, then what I would do is, again, click the pop-up button here, select variable, and then choose the particular input component that I want to set that property. Right? In this case, it's the measure input component, which is this one that we just added a moment ago. Right? And that, again, is basically it. So now I've got both the x-axis and the y-axis being dynamically set using input controls. So let's test it out. So let me select, let's say, total. Right? And the y-axis shows sum total. And if I select quantity, then the y-axis shows sum of quantity purchased. Okay, so that's some simple things. Let's continue on and see what else we can do in the same vein. Let's say that I wanted to make the grouping, in other words, the color coding that I have here. Let's say I wanted to make that dynamic also, and I wanted to give the user a choice of either, let's say, date or region. Right, so a couple of different choices. Right, and I want to basically put a control here under where it says break out by. I want to give it a couple choices of date or region. Right, so I could create another combo box just like I did above. But for the sake of variety, let's try a different input component. We'll try a radio button. Okay, so under the inputs, radio button is basically an interface that allows you to select one of several items. Everybody's familiar with these. So I'm just going to add a radio button component here. Okay, I'm going to remove the title in a moment. It's a little bit too big with the title, but I can remove that. But as we did before, let's go ahead and populate this input control. And again, the fields that I want to allow the user to choose here are date. So I'm just, again, dragging the fields in, date and region. So these are going to be two choices that the user can make for what the color coding represents, either date or region. Okay, let's go ahead and let me see if I can move this a little bit. Yeah, no, that basically has to stay there. It can only the radio button can only be moved in increments of the grid. So, so I guess that's the best I can do for the radio button. But let me get rid of the title, and I'll also give it a more meaningful name. So I'm going to open up the properties. Okay, and let's give it a better name, such as breakdown. And over here, you can see that there's a title property for the radio button. If you want to hide the title in its entirety, you can just turn off the visible option there. Right, so I've given it a more meaningful name. I've turned off the title, right, and then I can do something like this, and that doesn't look so bad. Okay, so I've got breakout by date and region, and currently these don't do anything, again, because I haven't hooked them up to the chart. So let's go back to the chart editor. Right. And where would I set this up? In other words, if I want this input control to modify the color coding, how would I set that up? Well, remember that to set the color coding on a chart, you use the color region down here, and you can see that I have the date field already added in that region. That's why it's breaking out the years by using color. Right? And so if I want to make this property dynamic, the procedure is the same as what we saw above. Right? I'm just going to press the little pop-up button over here where it says, the little triangle pop-up, and then select variable. And again, I get a choice of different input controls that I can use. In this case, I want to select the breakdown input control. Right, so that means that this breakdown control will set the field that is grouped by using color. So let's try it out. I'm going to select date. Okay, so there's date. And if I select region, okay, then I get region. Okay, so it's a little bit of a strange choice, because if you're in the state view, then you get the colors are basically each state is only in one region, so you get something that looks like this. But that's fine. So so we have this choice of breakout by date or by region, and we could switch, use different dimensions. Right. So if we switch to category, then it shows us, in this case it's the quantity purchased by region and by category and so on. Okay. So basically we have three properties now that we've made dynamic: the x-axis, the y-axis, and the color coding. Okay. Let's go a little bit further. And the next thing we'll do is we'll make a dynamic ranking. Right? So ranking is basically where you select the top or bottom of so many groups according to a measure. Right? So let's put this to something like this, like company. Right? So I've set this to company now, and you can see that there's a lot of companies. That makes it a little bit challenging for the user to figure out the information that they need. So the way we can make that easier for the user is to allow them to select, let's say, the top 5 or the top 10 companies. Right? So let's go ahead and add an input control. I'll use another radio button that will allow the user to do that. So here's a radio button. Okay, radio button. And what am I going to put in this radio button? Well, in this case, I'm not going to populate this with field names. Really, what I want the user to select here is either 5, 10, or 15. All right, so to enter those values, I'm just going to right-click on the radio button, select Properties, and I'll enter that list manually by clicking the Embedded option here, press Edit, and I'm just going to enter labels and values 5, 10, and 15. I made the labels and the values the same in this case, although of course you don't have to, but it makes sense here. And I'm also going to give this a meaningful name. I'll call this top N, right? Because I want the user to select the top 5, the top 10, or the top 15, so I'll call it top N. Press OK. Right, so there are my options, and here again I can hide the title, which I forgot to do. We don't really need that title there. And let's see if I can distribute this a little bit better. Okay, so something like that seems okay. Right, so I want the user to be able to select that they want the top 5, the top 10, or the top 15 companies or states or whatever. Okay, so now how do I make that happen? Well, again, I have to go back to the chart editor. Right, so I'm going to open up the chart editor again. And the first thing I need to figure out is where do I go to set that top N ranking? Right? How do I do that? And the place you go to do that is on the dimension. Right? The ranking is on the dimension when you want to rank the groups in a dimension. So what you do is you press the little calculator button here, the Edit Dimension button, and one of the properties that you'll find in there is a ranking property, and so you can select top, right? And if you wanted to set a fixed ranking, in other words, you always wanted the top 3 groups, then you would just enter a value here. But in this case, we want the number of groups to be set by the radio button, by this top N radio button that the user is going to make a selection in. So what I'll do is next to the number field, rather than have a fixed number, I'll pop up this little pop-up with the triangle again, select variable, and then select from here top N. Right, so basically I want to select the top so many groups where the number of groups is whatever the user selected in that input control. Okay, now the next question is according to what measure? Right, so we conceivably you could select the top 5 groups according to total. You could select the top 5 groups according to quantity purchased, and there's no guarantee that those would be the same rankings, right? You could have, one company that has the top sales might not be the company that has the top number of units sold. So we have to decide what measure is used to create that ordering and that ranking. And so what we'll do in this case is we want to use whatever measure the user selects from this measure input control. So down here where it says of, right, that's where you select the measure that determines the ranking. I'm going to select variable here and then select the measure input control. So basically in sum, what this is saying is give me the top so many groups according to whatever measure the user selects, and where the number of groups is determined by the number that the user selects. All right, so basically I've made this ranking completely dynamic now. I hope that makes sense. Press apply. And now we can test it out. Here right now I've got 5 selected, so I'm going to see the top 5 companies. If I select 10, I'll see the top 10 companies, and that should be the case regardless of what measure I select. Right? So here it's quantity purchased, and I've got the top 10 companies by quantity purchased. If I select total, then I'll have the top 10 companies by total. All right, and if I switch this to state, then I'm going to have the top 10 states by total, and so on. Made dynamic, we've got a top end selector, we've got breakout by color, we've got the dimension and the measure all made dynamic. Now let's look at something slightly different. So that's the majority of what I wanted to show you, because that's 80% of the kinds of modifications that you would typically be making to a dashboard, is making properties dynamic in that manner. But let me show you some other interesting things, variations on this idea, and also give you an idea of how you can use some script to make these kinds of dynamic modifications as well. And so what I'd like to do in the next step is up here I've got a label that says chart or crosstab. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to give the user a choice. Do they want to see the chart or do they want to see the crosstab? Chart or the crosstab. Now, what I can do before going ahead with that part is I might just want to make the crosstab behave the same way as the chart dynamically. In other words, respond to these different controls in the same way that the chart does. So in that case, the crosstab and the chart will be essentially analogous to one another. Just one will be graphical and one will be tabular. I'm going to pop open, I press the edit button in the top right corner. That opens the crosstab editor, which is where you can do all this stuff. Okay, and so for the row header, currently the row header is the dates, right? It's by year. That's because that's how, whenever you use a date field, the grouping is always by year by default. If you would want to change that, if you want it by month or something, then you would change that over here in the level setting, which can also be made dynamic, by the way. You can also parameterize that, but that's not what we're going to do here. What we want to do is just make the row header respond to the breakout group, the breakout field that the user selects. So that can be either date or region, right? So I want to see either date or region as the row header, depending on the user selection. Okay, so again, how do I do that? Well, I look for this little button, the little pop-up with the triangle in it, and then select variable. Right? Variable is what you select when you want to use an input control to dynamically control that property. And then you just choose the particular variable, the particular input control that you want to modify that property. Right? So in this case, it's the row header. It's the field that's displayed as the row headers. And I'm saying here that I want to use the breakdown input component. That's this one, this radio button. Breakdown is the name of that component. I want to use that component to determine what field goes on the row header. Same procedure for the column header. So this is the column header up here. Right now it's just a static value. It's always the category field, right? But if I want this to respond to the selection that the user makes in the dimension input control, then this procedure is the same. Press the little pop-up button with the triangle, select variable, and then choose the, from the list here, choose the particular input control that you want to modify that property. Okay, so I've got, now I've got this dimension input control setting the field that's displayed on the column header. Same procedure for the measure, right? So right now I've got this static measure total. Crosstab is always displaying the totals. But if I want this property to respond to the measure input control, then again, press the little button, select variable, and choose the particular input control that you want to manipulate that, that property. Right? So this is the summary property. Those are the values that appear in the the body cells of the crosstab, and now the field that's going to be used to generate those values is going to be whatever field the user selects from the measure combo box, which is either total or quantity purchased. Okay, so we can just see, well, let's go ahead and finish up the crosstab, and if there's any other questions, then feel free to ask. The last thing that we did is we want to show for the dimension for the column header, which is either category, company, or state, right, based on what the user selects, we want to show either the top 5, 10, or 15, depending on the selection that the user makes down over here. So again, how do you do that? Well, you click on the field, right? Here it's the column header field that you want to manipulate in that way, and that gives you a bunch of properties that you can select for the column header. And so what I'm going to select here is under ranking, right, just like we did for the chart, I'm going to say that I want the top so many groups. And again, this is for the column header, so the top so many groups in the column header. And rather than set that to a fixed value, I want that to be set by the input control that I called top n. Right? So that's where the user, top n is the name of this radio button where the user selects how many groups they want. Right? So I want the top so many groups according to whatever the user sets, according to, and then I'm going to select the measure that the user chooses. Okay, so this is going to give me the top so many groups according to whatever measure the user has selected, where the number of groups is set by the number that the user selects. Okay, so I'm going to press apply. Okay, and now basically the crosstab, as I mentioned before, should behave in the same way as the chart, and we can test it out. It should be, right, so there's state, top 10 states. If I switch this to company, then I'm going to see the top 10 companies, and so on. Right, so this is a scrolling table because the number of companies is larger than the number of columns that I've given it. But there are various ways to deal with that. We can make the table bigger, we can make the font smaller, and so on. But I'm not going to worry about that stuff now. So hopefully that explains how we got to the crosstab over here. Okay, so I'm going to save what I did so far, and then what I wanted to show you is how we can allow the user to select whether they want the chart view or the crosstab view. So to do that, I'm going to add a new radio button up here at the top. Right? And again, this is going to be slightly different than what we've done before. So I'm going to add a radio button up here, and I'm going to give the user a choice in this radio button of either chart or crosstab. Okay, so I'm going to go into the properties for the radio button, and I'll give it a name. First of all, call it chart or crosstab. Again, that's just an identifier, so I know what that is when I have to refer to it later. Chart or crosstab. And I'm going to set the values that appear in that radio button by pressing the edit button there. So I selected the embedded list option, press the edit button, and I'm going to add just a couple of choices here, chart and crosstab. I'm making the labels and the values the same, although in this case they're actually both arbitrary, because what we'll see is that I'm going to simply test the value that the user selects in script. So I'm going to use a script to determine what value the user has selected and then hide either the table or the chart. Okay, so right now I'm just setting up the radio buttons with these two options. All right, and there they are. And again, I could hide the title. I don't really need that title bar there, so I'm going to hide that and then just put these on the same line. Okay, so I'm giving the user a choice. Do they want to see chart or do they want to see crosstab? Now, the idea here is that I'm going to choose to either hide the chart or hide the crosstab depending on what the user selects. Now, that wouldn't make that much sense the way that I have this currently set up, because even if I hide the chart, I'm still going to have a huge empty space over here, so it doesn't really gain anything. And if I hide the crosstab, then I'll just have an empty space over here. So all that, although it would would limit the amount of information that I'm showing the user, so it would kind of perhaps make a easier experience for the user, but it wouldn't really buy me that much. But what I can do is I can combine these two things into a tabbed interface, and then they will occupy the same space on the dashboard, and the user can choose which of those he or she wants to see. Okay, so that's kind of the idea here. So I'm going to grab this table, and I'm going to throw it up on top of the chart. And when you do that, you have two options, either move component here or place component into tabbed interface. The truth is that you could choose either of these, and either of these will basically achieve the same result. But I'll just do the tabbed interface approach. So I'm going to press OK. It's interesting. Oh, there. Okay. I don't know. The table was down there for a moment. That was a surprise, but now it's up here as I expected. Right. So now we've got a tabbed interface, chart 1 and crosstab 1. But my intention here was really just to get both the chart and the crosstab into the same physical space. I'm not going to give the user the option of tabbing back and forth between those because I want the user to make that selection from the radio button up above. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to write a script on the chart visibility property so that when the user selects chart, the chart will be displayed and the table will be hidden, and when the user selects table, the table will be shown and the chart will be hidden. Okay, so let's click on the chart here. So this is a property of the chart that I want to modify. So I'm going to right-click on the chart, select Properties. Okay, and here are the chart properties, and I want to try to find the property that I want to modify here, and that is the visibility property. Right? So you can see that all components, not only charts, but all components have a visible property, and it has several static settings that you can choose: show, hide, or hide on print on export, right? So those are various options that you can choose, but you can also make this dynamic, and that's what I want to do in this case. And this might be the last thing that we do, although for those who want to stick around, I can do a couple more things. So let's make this dynamic, but I don't want to set this to variable in this case because, if I set this to variable and, for example, choose this chart or crosstab input control, right, then basically what it's going to try to do is when the user makes a choice of chart or crosstab, it's going to take that value, which is either chart or crosstab, and stick it into this property. That's not going to work because this property, right, if we take a look back at the legitimate values, this property can only accept these three values: show, hide, and hide on print and export. So if I pass a value in here like the string crosstab, it's not going to know what to do with that at all. Right? So we're going to have to do something else, and that something else is to use the expression option. So basically I'm going to write a little JavaScript that will set this visible property to either show or hide based on what the user selects here. So let's give this a try. I'm going to select the expression option, and then there's a little edit button. You don't have to write your expression in this tiny text field. It's much easier if you press the edit button. You get the full script editor. Right? And then the expression that I want to write here is basically I want to test the value that the user has selected up here in this radio button. So I'm going to write an if statement, and I'm going to say if, and now I need to find how do I get the value that the user selected here. Well, I can look for that under parameter. Right? So the script editor gives you access to properties of components and also various parameters that exist in the dashboard. And all of the input components that we've defined are considered parameters. So I can just look under the parameter folder, just look for the input component that I want to test, and it's this one, chart or crosstab. And that inserts the correct syntax. Parameter.chart or crosstab will give me the value that the user selected in that control. So if parameter.chart or crosstab is equal to chart, right, remember that the options that the user can submit from here are either chart or crosstab. So if the user has submitted a value of chart, then what I want to do, right, what I want to set this visible property to is show. Right? Remember, this script is operating on this property, right? So this is not a global script. This script is affecting only this property, so it can only return values that this property can legitimately be set to, and those values are show and hide on print on export. So I'm going to return, if the user selected chart, I'm going to return show for that property, else hide. Okay, so if the user selects chart in that radio button, then I'm going to, for the visible property of the chart, I'm going to set that visible property to show. Otherwise, in other words, if the user selected crosstab and they didn't select chart, then I want to set that property to hide. And that will take care of the chart. Okay. So hopefully that's relatively clear. If you're unconvinced or you don't understand the syntax, I can stick around and I can explain it, in a little bit more depth at the end. But it's kind of just basic JavaScript type syntax. So press OK, press OK. Okay, and that's for the chart. And what I'm going to do is set essentially the same script on the crosstab. So I'm going to go to the crosstab, right-click on the crosstab, and go into properties for the crosstab. Okay, and I could have copied the script from the chart because the modification is very slight, but it's an easy enough script to just write again. So this time I'm scripting the visible property of the crosstab table, and again I'm going to switch that to expression, open up the editor, and the script is going to be basically the same. Whoops. I can do it this way also, parameter.chart or crosstab. It's just going to be the inverse, right? So if the user selects chart up here, then what do I want to do for the table visibility? Well, I want to set that to hide. Else, if the user selected crosstab, then I want to set that to show. Okay, so it's the same script. I just basically inverted the hide and the show. When the user selects chart, I want to hide the table, otherwise show the table. Okay, and again, this script is operating on this visible property, so it must return legitimate values for that particular property. Okay, let's see if this works. Press OK, save what I did, and I'm going to do a preview. Let's preview this. Okay, and you'll note that in the preview, right, I don't see the crosstab. Why is that? Why don't I see the crosstab? Well, because the user, who is right now me, the user selected chart, right? And you'll notice that even though we had a tabbed interface, when only one of the tabs is active, in other words, if the items on the other tabs are hidden, then you don't actually see the tabbed interface. So we're not in a situation where we would have a weird interface with just one tab. It's understood that if there are no other tabs active, then it's just going to remove the tabs entirely. And if I click on crosstab, then I'm going to see the crosstab version. So this gives the user the opportunity of choosing whether they want to see a graphical version of this data or a tabular version of this data. All right, and everything should still be functional. I can select state or the top 5, and I can make these selections both for the crosstab and the chart. It's just that at any given time, only one of those will be visible to the user. Now, whether you would choose to do this or not really depends on your particular application. In some dashboards, you might prefer to have both the chart and the table displayed at the same time. In other cases, perhaps because you're in a crunch for space on the dashboard, you might choose to do something like this, give the user a choice which one they want to see. And of course, you could always just go with the standard tabbed interface and just have the chart on one tab, the crosstab on another tab, and then the user, instead of using these radio buttons, could just tab through the interface to find what they want. Okay, well that covers the majority of what I wanted to cover. There was one other thing that I was going to talk about, and so I will. But if anybody needs to leave at this point, that's basically the majority of the idea. So let me pause here for any questions and see if there's any questions on anything that we did. The other thing that I wanted to show is basically I want over here, I want to give the user, when the user makes a selection for dimension, which is either company, category, or state, I want them to see a selection list just for that one item. Right. So what's interesting to me is I think I may have. Let me just check the properties here. That's set to show. Oh, that's set to hide. Okay, so let me set the. I was playing with this before the webinar, and obviously I botched this up a little bit. Right. So this is the way it would have been if we had just made this tabbed interface. Then I'm going to get rid of this one. We're not going to have time for that. So this will be our last thing, right? So I have a tabbed interface here, and the way that I made this is I just dragged 3 selection lists one on top of the other, and that's how you make a tabbed interface for any components. So let's take a look at the preview, and there's our tabbed interface. And so this is kind of a weird way to display it, but the reason I did it like this is because I want the user's choice from the dimension input control to determine which selection list they're going to see here. So in other words, if they select category, then I want them to see a selection list for category. If they select state, I want them to see a selection list for state, and so on. Right, and I can do that basically by using the same principle that I used to control whether they see the chart or the crosstab. Right, so I'm going to use a little script that selectively hides or shows these different selection lists based on the user's choice. So let's just go ahead and whip that up. So I'm on the, I went to the tab that has the company selection list, and I want this one to display, this selection list to be displayed only when the user selects company from this dimension input control. So the procedure is the same as what we just did a few moments ago. Right-click on that selection list, go to Properties, and every component has a visible property, as I mentioned before. Right, and that's the property that I'm going to script. Right, so I'm going to pop up the expression option next to that property, and then press the Edit button so I can write this little expression. And the expression is going to look very much like what we wrote before. So I'm going to do an if test and find the input control that I want to test. In this case, it's the dimension input control. Right, I want to test what value the user selected from there. So I'm going to say if they selected company. Right, I'm scripting the selection list that I'm scripting right now, although I can't see it. This is the company selection list. Right, so if the user selected as the dimension company, then I want to show, I want to show this particular component, this particular selection list. So I'm setting the visible property to show, else. In other words, if the user selected something other than company, then I want to hide. And now for reasons of speed, I'm going to copy this. So just copy that. Right, so there's the script that's for this selection list, for the company selection list. If the user selected company as the dimension, show that selection list, otherwise hide it. Okay, so that's for that one. And now I'm just going to proceed to do the other two. Right, so this is the state selection list. So I'm going to do the same procedure, right-click on the selection list, select properties, and then I'm going to add script, expression script to the visible property. And I'm just going to paste the script that I already wrote in there. The only change here is going to be if parameter.dimension is equal to state. So this script now says, if the user selected state from the dimension input control, then I want to show, this time it's the state selection list, show that selection list, otherwise hide it. Okay. So that's that one, and then the final one, same procedure, scripting the visible property, pasting in that same script, and this is a category this time. This is the category selection list. So if the user selects category as the dimension that they're seeing on the chart and on the table, then I want to show them the category selection list so they can filter that. Otherwise, I want to hide it. Okay, so that's another example of scripting these various properties, making these properties dynamic by using expression script. So let's test that out. I'm going to save this, and then let's go to the preview. Right, and let's see if this works or not. Right, so what I expect is I expect to see a selection list here that corresponds to the user's choice of dimension. So if I select company, there's company. If I select category, right now I see the category selection list, and it should be fully functional. Right, I can select different categories in there. Right. And then if I select state, right now I've got the state selection list. I can select different states and so on. Okay, so that's just another illustration of how you can have a lot of fun with dynamic properties by controlling visibility, by controlling whether components are enabled or disabled. You can do, some interesting user interface things. Okay, well that's basically all I wanted to show you today, and even at that I ran quite long. So I'll stop here and take any questions that anybody has. One question that everybody always asks, which was already